This story should not be listened to by overly impressionable people. Even experienced police officers who had grown accustomed to the most terrible crimes over the years were forced to seek help from psychologists after what they saw in that basement. On an October morning in 2015, a small town on the outskirts of New Hampshire was still living its usual life. Rarely did anything happen here that would deserve the attention of even the local newspaper. Measured pace and silence seemed to be part of the very essence of this place. Local residents were accustomed to the fact that nothing truly terrible could happen here, but this day forever changed the townspeople's ideas about their small, safe world. House number 17 on Chestnut Street was an old, unremarkable building that had long attracted no one's attention. It stood almost at the very end of the street, behind an unkempt garden and a half-destroyed fence, and seemed long forgotten by everyone. The owners changed almost annually. Someone tried to repair it, someone simply rented it out and moved on. But the essence was the same. The house stood empty more often than it was occupied. The new owner, John Henderson, decided to seriously engage in restoring the house, dreaming of finally settling here for a long time. From the very beginning, he understood that there would be a lot of work ahead. The house had stood abandoned for almost 2 years. The basement was filled with old furniture, broken inventory, and other unnecessary junk. Therefore, John decided to start precisely from there, from the basement, which caused him a particularly unpleasant feeling. Closer to evening, John went down the old, creaking stairs. The weak lighting barely allowed him to distinguish objects, but among the chaos he noticed a strange object standing in the corner. It was a metal barrel covered with deep layers of rust, as if deliberately hidden behind other things. He tried to move it, but it turned out to be heavy and almost impossible to lift. The more he peered at the barrel, the stronger he felt an incomprehensible anxiety. John was not one of the fearful, but now he felt that he did not want to be alone with this thing. The next morning, having called a friend, he decided to deal with this strange find. Together they struggled to pull the barrel into the light and tried to open it. The lid seemed to have grown permanently to the metal, but after several attempts, it finally gave way. It was precisely at this moment that John's life was divided into before and after. What he saw inside was forever etched in his memory. He felt his legs give way, and the air in the basement became heavy and viscous. In a blanket that had long lost its colors were remains that had lain here for many years. This sight was so shocking that his friend instantly ran upstairs and, barely restraining himself, called the police. The first police cars appeared near the house within a few minutes. John sat on the steps of the house, pale and completely lost, answering investigators' questions monosyllabically and confusedly. He was sure that now there would definitely be no peaceful life for him in this town. But the most terrible was yet to come. When the police went downstairs, what they saw shocked even the most experienced officers. Local law enforcement, accustomed to family quarrels and petty thefts, froze, trying to comprehend what they would have to face. Later, when one of the detectives was talking with colleagues, he said, "It seemed to us we had seen everything, but what was in that barrel made many of us think whether we had been working in the police for too long. This was not just another crime scene. The very atmosphere surrounding the find was unbearable. It smelled of dampness, decomposition, and something else, difficult to explain, that made people in the basement experience an almost physical sensation of panic." One of the young officers, after the first inspection, ran outside and could not come to himself for a long time. Another asked to be immediately relieved from further work at the crime scene. It was precisely this condition that local newspapers later described with a short phrase. The police officers suffered a nervous breakdown at the sight of this. The investigation that began that day immediately faced a serious problem. No one in the town knew about the disappearance of a person during the period when this happened. Police checked archives for the past 2 decades, questioned local residents, but everywhere met only surprised looks and negative answers. People began to whisper to each other, the town filled with rumors, but not one of them gave an answer to the main question: who was it? Important details surfaced a little later. Experts indicated an approximate date. This happened not yesterday, not a year ago, but back in the mid-90s. For more than 20 years, someone had hidden this secret in an ordinary house through which dozens of people had passed, suspecting nothing about the nightmare hidden literally under their feet. Investigators began checking everyone who had ever lived in the house or could have had any relation to it. The first suspect was the previous owner, who had suddenly sold the house for a pittance and left the town without explaining the reasons. His identity raised many questions, but that was not the main thing. The deeper the police studied the house, the more strange things were discovered that no one had noticed before. There remained one more person who aroused suspicion: a neighbor, an elderly and silent man who had lived across the road all his life. During interrogations, he answered sparingly, averted his gaze, and constantly repeated that he knew nothing. But it was precisely in his behavior that police noticed hidden nervousness. The town froze in expectation. Time passed, tension grew, and people already understood that this case would not be like any other. The secret was too deep and too dark, and its revelation would forever change not only the small town, but also the fates of all who lived in it. But the main thing was that this find was only the beginning of a long, frightening story that would make many ask the question: how well do we really know those who live next to us? News about the find in house number 17 spread like lightning. By evening of the same day, Chestnut Street was full of reporters' cars and local curious onlookers. However, soon a cordon was established around the house, beyond which no one was allowed. The police were clearly nervous. In the entire history of this place, there had never been such crimes. For a small town that even saw major thefts infrequently, the discovery of such remains became a real shock. The examination began immediately, and the initial conclusions of the forensic scientists were announced the next morning. It turned out that this happened about 20 years ago, in the mid-90s. This detail finally put the investigators at a dead end. How did it happen that all these years no one noticed the disappearance of a person of that age? There were no missing person reports. There were no photographs in police archives. There were not even rumors that someone had stopped appearing at school or on the streets of the town. The one who was found in the old house seemed to have never existed in this world, and this confused even experienced police officers. At this stage of the investigation, detectives decided to carefully study the history of the house itself. It was built back in the early 1950s, belonged to the same family for about 30 years, and then changed owners several times. Records from the municipal archive showed that from 1990 to 1996, the house was owned by a certain Patrick O'Connor, a withdrawn and silent man, about whom neighbors could remember almost nothing. Only one elderly neighbor living 3 houses away noticed that Mr. O'Connor was allegedly strange and very rarely left the house. However, she could not provide more details. When police began looking for O'Connor himself, it turned out that he had long since moved to another state, selling the house in the late 90s. He sold it quickly and at a rather low price. This fact aroused suspicion in the investigation. Detectives set out to find him, hoping to get at least some information. But when they found the former owner, already an elderly man, he looked absolutely genuinely surprised. O'Connor willingly answered questions, spoke slowly, calmly, confidently. He explained that he sold the house cheaply because he urgently needed money after his divorce, and from the town he wanted only one thing: to leave it as soon as possible. Detectives checked every word he said. The alibi turned out to be indisputable, confirmed by documents. Meanwhile, local residents increasingly recalled another person, an old man named Benjamin Sullivan, that very neighbor whose house stood opposite across the street. Sullivan never communicated with neighbors, preferring quiet solitude. Someone said he was a strange person. Someone considered him just an old, harmless retiree. But the police latched onto his figure not by chance. One of the witnesses claimed that in the 90s he repeatedly noticed how Sullivan went to O'Connor's house when he was not in town. Police officers paid a visit to Benjamin Sullivan and found him in a state of extreme irritation. The old man was clearly displeased with their appearance, but was forced to answer questions. He admitted that he sometimes looked after the house while O'Connor was away on business, but he denied that he saw anyone foreign there or anything unusual. He spoke harshly, nervously tapping his fingers on the table, avoiding direct eye contact. The police officers sensed his uneasiness, but the old man refused further explanations. The detectives returned later, demanding samples for DNA comparison, to which Sullivan sharply refused, declaring that he saw no reason to undergo testing since he had not committed a crime. Tension was growing. On the third day of the investigation, the police received the results of the DNA analysis found on the blanket. The trace turned out to be male and surprisingly did not match either O'Connor or those samples that were already in the police database. The one who committed this crime had never before come to the attention of law enforcement agencies. The investigation decided to expand the search circle. They began checking all relatives and acquaintances of the former owners. Investigators from neighboring states began arriving in town, conducting many-hour interrogations. People were forced to remember any details that could be significant. And here again came a deaf wall. No one could name either a first name or a surname, or even an approximate place from where the victim could have appeared. The police began studying the surroundings of the house in those years when everything probably happened. They raised archives of telephone calls, checked financial transactions of O'Connor and his neighbors, but everything looked clean and smooth, without the slightest clues. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the city was becoming increasingly heavy. People no longer hid their fear and tension, avoided communication, began to withdraw into their homes. It seemed that every detail of the past could be the key to solving this frightening mystery that had lived among them for so long unnoticed by anyone. Eventually, the police gained access to old photographs of neighbors and archival documents. Among the yellowed pictures, a person unexpectedly emerged whom no one had noticed before. A tall man standing next to O'Connor. Who this was, no one could say. The police decided to find him, but soon it turned out that this man had died in a car accident back in the late 90s. The city, immersed in fear and anxiety, gradually began to realize that before them was a story not from the category of simple crimes. This was a story where even police officers felt how the ground was slipping from under their feet. No one yet understood how deep and dark the abyss was that had opened under house number 17. But it was already obvious. This really was not for the faint-hearted. By mid-November 2015, the town, located among the dense forests of New Hampshire, was already mired in painful waiting for answers that were not coming. People stopped sharing rumors even among themselves, fearing to say aloud once more what frightened them most. A murderer had lived next to them all these years. Meanwhile, detectives searched for at least some clues in the past, sorting through old photographs, forgotten documents, and testimonies of people who had long left this place. House number 17 on Chestnut Street continued to remain the center of police attention. Although the police officers themselves were already tired of the endless dead end in which the case found itself. The county police commissioner admitted at a closed meeting that in 20 years of his career, he had never encountered such a complex investigation. He openly declared to colleagues, "We need to be prepared for the fact that this case will remain unsolved." But no one wanted to admit defeat aloud. Then the investigators decided to return to old archives, hoping that they had missed some detail that they had not paid attention to before. And indeed, unexpectedly for themselves, They discovered a photograph taken approximately in the mid-90s. In the picture were three men: the former owner of the house, Patrick O'Connor, his brother, Thomas O'Connor, and a stranger who had not previously come to police attention. The man was tall, with a gloomy expression on his face, and stood slightly behind the others, as if he did not want to get into the frame. Verification of this photograph began. Patrick O'Connor confirmed that next to him was his younger brother Thomas, who died in a car accident in 1998. But he could not or would not remember the name of the third person. The detectives sensed his confusion. However, Patrick insisted that he hardly knew this person, silently rejecting all attempts by the investigation to obtain more information from him. Then the police went to a senior retired detective who had worked in the city in the 90s. The old detective looked at the picture for a long time, then reluctantly remembered the name of the third man. It was Gregory Miller, a person who came to town in the early 90s from the state of Vermont. Miller worked as a laborer at a construction site, often changed places of residence, rarely stayed in one place longer than a few months. After 1997, no one saw him in town. Now the police concentrated on searching for Gregory Miller. Investigators assumed that this very person could have left DNA on the blanket. Requests were sent to several neighboring states, databases were checked, dozens of people were interviewed. As a result, Miller was found in a small town in Massachusetts, where he worked as a mechanic in an auto service. When the detectives met with him, Miller looked confused and genuinely surprised. He immediately confirmed that he indeed lived in the city on Chestnut Street and several times visited the O'Connor brothers, but denied his involvement in anything serious. Miller told that the brothers constantly quarreled and the relationship between them was very tense. He remembered how once he found Thomas O'Connor in a state of severe alcoholic intoxication, threatening his brother, but then quickly fell silent and declared that he did not want to say anything more without a lawyer. The detectives obtained a sample of his DNA and went back to New Hampshire. Meanwhile, city residents began increasingly mentioning the name of Thomas O'Connor. The more they remembered about him, the more dark and unpleasant stories surfaced. It turned out that Thomas was an aggressive, conflicted person, often abused alcohol, and had several arrests for minor offenses in other states. But all these details were hidden from local residents by his family, trying to maintain the appearance of well-being. Patrick O'Connor was again called to the police. This time, the interrogation was harsh and lengthy. The police officers insisted that he finally reveal the details of the conflict with his brother. Patrick was silent for a long time, but then still told that Thomas indeed several times came to his house in great agitation, demanded money, and accused him of destroying his life. The last time he saw his brother was shortly before his death, but he knew nothing about any terrible crimes committed by Thomas. A few days later came the results of Gregory Miller's DNA analysis. The result turned out to be negative. Miller was clean, and now the investigation again returned to the starting point. In the town again reigned death tension. Local residents, tired of uncertainty, began to avoid each other, even those who previously did not believe in any rule. House number 17 now stood sealed. Many avoided it, afraid to even glance in that direction. Longtime residents whispered about details that had previously seemed unimportant. Strange sounds at night, light flickering in the windows, figures of people appearing and disappearing near the house. But the police already clearly understood that all these trifles would not lead to anything concrete. The investigation was marking time. with each new check, with each new questioned witness becoming convinced that behind all the evidence stood something greater, elusive, much more frightening than just a crime. It seemed that the house on Chestnut Street kept a secret that might never be solved. This was exactly what made even experienced police officers feel the weight and hopelessness at the sight of folders with endless reports and photographs that showed someone else's life. And now only a grim and unsolved mystery remained. Time passed, and the town on the outskirts of New Hampshire sank deeper into the dark waters of anxious expectation. The residents, long tired of the endless investigation, avoided looking each other in the eyes, as if each of them could be involved in the events of 20 years ago. However, despite the police efforts, the case remained unsolved and seemed to hit an invisible wall. At this time, investigators began to study more closely the immediate surroundings of house number 17. One of the key figures, again, turned out to be the neighbor across the street, Benjamin Sullivan. Sullivan, an elderly man who had lived in this house all his life, suddenly dramatically changed his behavior. When the police again tried to talk to him, he behaved aggressively for the first time, not letting the detectives cross the threshold. Such behavior surprised the police. Previously, he had been restrained and cold, but now he openly expressed hostility. Sullivan declared that he was tired of questions and would say nothing without a lawyer. When they asked him for a DNA sample, the man categorically refused, explaining that he was not obliged to justify himself for a crime he did not commit. The investigators decided to check what exactly had so disturbed Sullivan and turned to the town archives. Soon it became clear that the Sullivan family had lived here for several generations, and its past turned out to be far from as clean as it seemed at first glance. Neighbors remembered that the grandfather of the current house owner was extremely withdrawn and even gloomy, and Benjamin's father had once been detained by police for attacking a neighbor, but got off with a fine and a suspended sentence. Benjamin himself grew up silent and withdrawn, preferring solitude even in childhood, which sometimes caused concern among the town residents. The detectives decided to check Sullivan's connections with house number 17 and reached the former owner, Patrick O'Connor. During a new interrogation, Patrick suddenly remembered that the neighbor had indeed repeatedly offered to buy the house from him, motivating this by saying that he allegedly wanted to unite the territories. O'Connor refused because he felt a strange dislike for Sullivan and did not want to have anything to do with him. It was after one of such refusals that Sullivan allegedly became very angry, declared that Patrick would regret his decision, and literally slammed the door in his face. These testimonies became grounds for detention. On one of the grey December days, police cars appeared at Sullivan's house, and Benjamin himself was taken to the station for official interrogation. The town was instantly gripped by anxiety, because for the first time in many years the police openly named the name of a suspect. Sullivan answered coldly and briefly, denying any connection with the crime. When he was again offered to voluntarily take a DNA test, he, after remaining silent, unexpectedly agreed, stating that he was tired of this persecution and wanted to prove his innocence. While waiting for the expertise results, the police began digging through old archives and Sullivan's personal belongings, trying to find at least some connection with what happened in the mid-90s. They reviewed every paper, every old album, every letter they could find in his house. And then, going through a pile of old photographs, yellowed with time, the detectives came across a snapshot that made them freeze. In the photograph, dated approximately 1994, a picnic was captured, obviously somewhere in the forest near the city. Among several unfamiliar people in the foreground sat Sullivan himself, and next to him, a blonde girl who was strangely similar to the image obtained after reconstructing the appearance of the one found in the basement. Both were smiling as if they were very close. The police, amazed by the find, immediately sent the photo for additional expertise. Sullivan, meanwhile, remained at the police station, completely confident that he would soon be released. And he was right. The DNA test result came back negative. Sullivan was not the person whose genetic trace remained at the crime scene. Despite this, the police again called him for interrogation. When he was shown the photograph, Sullivan's facial expression changed for the first time to genuine confusion and anxiety. For several minutes, he remained silent, examining the snapshot, then reluctantly admitted that he indeed knew the girl, but refused to explain who she was, stating that he did not remember the details of that day. The detectives insisted, but Sullivan stubbornly repeated that he had forgotten everything. He looked exhausted, as if the very thought of the past caused him pain. After the interrogation, the police were forced to release him home, having no strong grounds for detention. But the snapshot had already managed to become a sensation within the police department. The next day, other photographs taken in the same period were found in the archives showing the same people. In the center of the group again was that same blonde girl, and next to her in several shots stood a man whom none of the police had seen before and whom witnesses had not mentioned. The investigators began checking old resident lists, school archives, photographs from local newspapers, trying to establish the identity of the stranger. But he seemed to have dissolved in time, leaving behind only blurred outlines on old photographic paper. The city again plunged into painful expectation. Sullivan now rarely went out, avoided neighbors' glances, and almost stopped communicating even with relatives. He became even more withdrawn than before, and it seemed that he was tormented not only by police suspicion, but by something much deeper and more painful. The police continued silently going through old snapshots, feeling anxiety that solving the case was getting further and further away from them. None of them then yet suspected that the next discovery, made almost by chance, would change their understanding of everything that seemed clear and force them to look anew at every person in this quiet town. While the town residents finally withdrew into themselves, the investigative team continued unsuccessfully going through dozens of photographs and archival documents, trying to catch at least some lead. Finally, in one of the old boxes with documents, a letter was discovered that turned out to be the key to a new lead. The letter was handwritten by the former house owner himself, Patrick O'Connor, back in the late 90s. In it, he mentioned his brother, Thomas O'Connor, with whom he had not maintained contact for many years. The investigators noticed that Patrick described his brother as a person with a complex, hot-tempered, and unstable character, whose appearance in town was always associated with troubles. The police immediately called Patrick for another interrogation, which this time took place in a tense atmosphere, almost without any pauses or indulgences. The investigators were determined. Patrick looked tired and irritated, but this time did not try to evade and told much more than before. According to him, Thomas indeed came to town approximately in the mid-90s, just during the period when everything happened. Patrick remembered that his brother looked exhausted and was constantly on the verge of a breakdown. Their relationship was so tense that Patrick asked his brother to leave his house already on the third day of his stay. After that, they never communicated again. The investigators turned to the archives again and found records confirming that Thomas O'Connor had indeed been in the city during the specified period. They also managed to find witnesses who had seen him then. One of the neighbors clearly remembered how Thomas walked down the street late in the evening, talking to himself and expressing some kind of aggression with gestures. He caused people to feel anxiety and apprehension, but no one dared to contact the police, attributing this to ordinary family conflicts. On the same day, detectives found several more old photographs of Thomas, comparing them with the previously found photograph where that same blonde-haired guest was captured. The man in the pictures was so similar to the brother of the former house owner that the investigators had almost no doubts left. The investigation decided to urgently find Thomas, believing that he could be directly connected to the crime that had occurred. However, determining Thomas O'Connor's whereabouts proved to be much more complicated than expected. He had no official place of residence, had not paid taxes for a long time, and was practically not mentioned anywhere in recent years. His name was absent even from official state databases, which seemed very strange to the investigators. Patrick admitted that he had not maintained contact with his brother for more than 20 years and had no idea whether he was even alive. The police sent several requests to neighboring states while simultaneously continuing to question people who might remember Thomas. Soon, an answer came from Massachusetts. In the local police database, a protocol was found about a traffic accident that had occurred in the winter of 1998. The protocol contained the name of Thomas O'Connor. The man had died at the scene of the accident, and this was officially confirmed by documents and examination results. This news became a shock for the investigation, as Thomas, who had seemed like the perfect suspect, now again fell out of the crime picture. Patrick learned about his brother's death only from the police officers and was stunned by what he heard. He seemed confused and genuinely upset, and it was obvious that he could not have had any idea that his brother had died more than 20 years ago. The police, however, decided to thoroughly check the circumstances of Thomas's death. During the investigation, it turned out that the accident was indeed ordinary and had occurred due to his fault. On an icy highway, Thomas had lost control of his car and collided with a tree. No suspicious circumstances were revealed, and Thomas himself had led an extremely secluded and isolated lifestyle at that time, practically not communicating with those around him. The reason for his arrival in the town several years before his death remained unclear, but no obvious traces connecting him to the crime were found.
While investigators again plunged into uncertainty, the town's residents continued to live painfully under the pressure of constant fear. No one understood anymore who could be trusted and who was simply hiding something terrible. Each new discovery, each new name again and again, caused anxiety, giving no moment of peace to people accustomed to a quiet life. Patrick O'Connor, after all these events, preferred to leave the town forever. He sold all his property and left the place with which such a dark chapter of his life was connected. The house opposite, belonging to neighbor Sullivan, on the contrary, plunged into even greater isolation and alienation. Benjamin Sullivan rarely stepped outside his threshold, avoiding the gazes of passers-by and clearly trying to hide from foreign eyes. And the photograph with which the next wave of investigation had begun now lay in the police archive, and it was almost no longer looked at. The man in it, Thomas O'Connor, remained forever in the past, taking with him the secret of his visits and the real reasons for his actions. No one could ask him anymore what he was doing in that house, what he knew about what was happening, and what had actually occurred in those dark days of the 1990s. After the figure of Thomas O'Connor finally disappeared from the investigation board, the detectives decided to carefully return to the very beginning again, hoping to discover details that had been missed in the first days of the investigation. Now special attention was paid to people who had lived in the immediate vicinity of the ill-fated house on Chestnut Street in those very years when the crime occurred. One of the key witnesses became an elderly woman named Emily Harper, who had lived on the street all her life. Initially, Emily, citing her advanced age and weak memory, did not want to talk to the police, but after long persuasion, agreed to tell the little that she knew. The woman spoke slowly, remained silent for long periods, as if carefully sorting through past events in her memory. Emily remembered how once in the mid-1990s, she witnessed a strange event. Late in the evening, around midnight, she saw through the window of her house a car standing near house number 17. In the car sat a person whose face was hidden by darkness. The car did not turn off its headlights, as if the driver was waiting for someone. After a few minutes, an unknown man quickly approached the car, got into the passenger seat, and the car drove away. The woman had never seen this car before and did not know who these people were. The police officers carefully listened to Emily and tried to learn additional details: the color of the car, the license plate, or make. But memory had already failed the witness. All she remembered was the unusual behavior of the strangers and the feeling of anxiety that had overwhelmed her that evening. Meanwhile, the police technical specialists decided to return to a detailed examination of the barrel itself and the room in which it was discovered. The criminologist's attention was drawn to barely noticeable traces on the basement floor, similar to scratches from moving a heavy object. After conducting additional examination, the specialists concluded the barrel with the find could have been moved to the basement sometime after the crime was committed. This version caused a real revolution in the detective's consciousness, opening new variants of event development. Now a version appeared that the crime could have occurred in a completely different place, and the remains were placed in the basement later. Intensive questioning of residents began again, this time with emphasis on the period after the 2000s. The investigators checked everyone who had lived in the house after Patrick O'Connor. Among the tenants was one person whose behavior immediately attracted police attention. This was Robert Harris, who had rented the house from 2004 to 2006. He quickly left the city citing a job change and never returned again. When the police found Robert Harris in a neighboring state, he initially willingly agreed to talk. However, upon learning the topic of conversation, he sharply closed up and almost completely refused further comments. Soon it turned out that Harris had a criminal record for domestic violence, but no serious crimes had been noted against him. Nevertheless, the police insisted on checking his DNA sample, which he, after long persuasion, provided. The result turned out to be negative. But the main result of this stage of the investigation was that the detectives finally became convinced that the crime and the movement of the remains could have been committed at different times by different people.
Perhaps one of the tenants, having discovered someone else's trace from the past, simply got rid of the unwanted find by placing it in a distant corner of the basement, not wanting to deal with the police.
This hypothesis explained why no one had noticed or said anything for so long. People simply did not want to get involved in other people's problems, and especially in a criminal case. But on the other hand, it made everything that was happening even more gloomy and frightening. It turned out that several people could have been involved in the crime directly or indirectly. In an attempt to understand at least something, the investigators again summoned Benjamin Sullivan, the elderly neighbor, for repeated questioning. Now he looked tired, having almost completely lost the desire to resist. Sullivan confirmed that he had seen Robert Harris and other tenants several times, but had personally never communicated with any of them. He also admitted that back in the early 2000s, he had seen unknown people carrying something into the house. When asked why he had not reported this to the police earlier, Sullivan dryly replied, "It was not my house and not my problems." Now, after many years, his answer sounded not just cold, but frighteningly indifferent. After this conversation, the police decided that Sullivan really was not hiding anything and was most likely not involved in what had happened. Nevertheless, the detectives could not get rid of the feeling that he knew more than he was saying and was simply tired of resisting the past. Finally, in the City Library archive, accidentally found when checking newspaper materials, the investigators came across an article from 1995. It reported a minor incident. An unknown man was spotted near house number 17 on Chestnut Street, after which he quickly disappeared. The article had no details, except that the man seemed suspicious to local residents. There was no photograph attached to the article, but the mention of this person again stirred anxious thoughts in the minds of the police. Trying to understand what exactly could connect all these people and events, the detectives once again reviewed old photographs, letters, and documents. But the answers eluded them, leaving only a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. Soon,
the townspeople learned that house number 17 was again put up for sale, already for a symbolic sum. None of the locals even thought of acquiring it, as if already understanding that a dark secret was forever connected with this place. The house gradually fell into disrepair, becoming a symbol of the fact that the crime that happened here forever divided the life of the town into before and after. Meanwhile, the investigation increasingly focused on the family of the former owner of the house, Patrick O'Connor. After long and painful negotiations with distant relatives of the family, an important detail emerged that had remained hidden until now. Thomas, Patrick's deceased brother, indeed had a daughter whom none of the relatives had seen for more than 25 years. Her name was Jennifer. Jennifer's story turned out to be so tangled and dark that even the relatives themselves spoke about her reluctantly. Jennifer's mother, from whom Thomas had long been divorced, practically did not communicate with the O'Connor family after the breakup. The relatives admitted that, after the divorce, Thomas repeatedly conflicted with his ex-wife over their daughter, insisting that she live with him. After one such conflict, which occurred approximately in early 1995, Jennifer was taken away by Thomas, and after that, none of the relatives saw her again or heard anything about her. Having received this information, the police immediately summoned Patrick O'Connor for another conversation. This time, Patrick looked depressed and nervous, clearly not expecting that old family secrets would surface. He was silent for a long time before speaking. According to him, Thomas indeed mentioned his daughter during their last meeting, but spoke about her as if he was having constant difficulties with her. However, Patrick categorically stated that he had never personally seen Jennifer and knew nothing about her further fate. He did not even suspect that his brother could have brought her to town at that time. Meanwhile, the police carefully checked any information concerning Jennifer. The investigators contacted her mother, living in another state, who confirmed that Thomas indeed took their daughter after the conflict. The woman said that in the last days before her father took her, Jennifer looked very frightened and did not want to go with her father. After the disappearance, she tried to find her through the police, but Thomas constantly changed his place of residence, and the police of different states refused to help her, considering it an internal family conflict. The DNA examination meanwhile confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The remains found in house number 17 indeed belonged to Jennifer. Now the police faced a terrible reality. Patrick's relative, Thomas's daughter, who for many years was considered simply missing, had been nearby all these years, and no one suspected it. When this information was announced to Patrick, he looked absolutely shattered. The man clearly did not understand how such a thing could have happened literally under his feet. He insisted that Thomas never mentioned that he had brought Jennifer to the house on Chestnut Street. However, the police doubted his words. It was clear that Patrick was trying to distance himself as much as possible from the terrible crime that had occurred right in his house. The relatives, having learned the truth, were also shocked and immediately began to put forward their own assumptions. Many of them considered Thomas capable of such a crime, especially considering his difficult character and tendency toward aggression. In their opinion, the cause of the tragedy could have been that he could not cope with raising his daughter and decided to solve the problems that arose in this way. This version was actively discussed among relatives who were convinced that Thomas was the culprit of the tragedy. However, despite such a clear picture, the criminalists were awaited by another turn that made the investigators doubt the truthfulness of this theory. The results of repeated examination of the DNA found on the blanket showed that the genetic material belonged not to Thomas O'Connor at all. Moreover, this genetic trace clearly pointed to a relative of the family and a person who was alive and had been living all this time near the crime scene. This news shocked not only the police but also the family members themselves. Now suspicions shifted to someone among those who had not even come under police attention before. The investigators understood that the criminal had been very close all this time, being confident in his absolute impunity. And now there was only one task: to precisely determine which family member could have been hiding such a terrible secret for so many years. The next check concerned all relatives living in the city and in the vicinity. Among them was Thomas and Patrick's cousin, William O'Connor, a man who had always been considered an exemplary member of society. He worked as an accountant, lived quietly and modestly, regularly participated in the public life of the city, and never aroused suspicion. That is why, when the police summoned him for questioning and demanded that he provide a DNA sample, he was amazed and even offended by such a formulation of the question. William provided the DNA sample without resistance, confidently stating that he had nothing to hide and the police were only wasting their time in vain. While the criminalists waited for the results, the investigators began carefully checking William's past. It turned out that despite his impeccable reputation, he had minor problems with the law in his youth, particularly for harassment of women, but then he managed to avoid serious punishment. Relatives said that William had always been too withdrawn and tried to stay away from family events, preferring his solitude. These details alarmed the investigation. And then, after several days, the DNA analysis results came. The result was unambiguous. The trace belonged precisely to William O'Connor. When the investigators informed him of this news, William lost his composure for the first time and became noticeably nervous. He was silent for several minutes and then declared that he needed a lawyer. The police finally understood that they were on the threshold of solving one of the most terrible crimes in the history of the town. And now, it remained only to force William to tell the truth about how and why he committed what shocked the entire city after so many years. After receiving irrefutable DNA results, William O'Connor was in a detention cell awaiting interrogation. Everyone who knew him personally could not believe that this quiet and modest man turned out to be involved in such a cruel crime. Nevertheless, the facts spoke for themselves. His genetic trace left the police no doubt about his involvement in the events that shocked the entire city. The interrogation lasted several hours. Initially, William categorically refused to admit guilt and talk about this topic at all. But the investigators presented him not only with DNA results, but also with details that convincingly proved his involvement. Finally, after prolonged pressure and repeated calls to tell the truth, he finally gave in. When William began to tell his story, an oppressive silence hung in the interrogation room. He spoke slowly and quietly, sometimes falling silent, as if trying to understand how he had come to pronounce this terrible truth aloud for the first time. It turned out that in the mid-90s, Thomas, Jennifer's father, had indeed come to visit his brother Patrick in the city. His daughter was with him, whom Thomas could not leave at home because of a conflict with her mother. Having arrived in the city, Thomas stayed with Patrick, but their relationship quickly deteriorated. Then Thomas asked William, who lived in the neighboring house and was their cousin, to look after Jennifer for some time while he settled matters with Patrick. At first, William agreed, since no one suspected anything bad about him, and Jennifer herself felt quite calm in his house. However, after some time, she began to worry, asking when her father would return, and constantly asking to go home. This began to irritate William, who was not used to the presence of other people in his house and quickly lost patience. One evening, a conflict occurred between them. Jennifer tried to leave the house, but William, frightened that she would tell relatives about his rude treatment, stopped her using force. The situation quickly got out of control, and William, losing his composure, committed that very terrible thing that was subsequently discovered many years later in Patrick's house. After what happened, he panicked and tried to get rid of the traces. Taking advantage of Patrick's temporary departure and Thomas's absence, he broke into his relative's house and placed the remains in a metal barrel, which he then hid in the basement, among old junk and construction debris. He was sure that no one would ever find what he had done. After all, the house was abandoned, and Patrick was soon planning to leave the city. Over time, William almost convinced himself that this had never happened. He returned to ordinary life, continued working as an accountant, maintained the reputation of an exemplary citizen, and avoided any suspicions.
Sometimes he passed by the house on Chestnut Street, but each time he forced himself not to think about what had happened, hoping that over time his crime would be forgotten and would forever remain a secret. Meanwhile, Thomas, not finding Jennifer after returning to the city, decided that the girl had run away back to her mother. Due to numerous conflicts and mutual dislike, they practically did not communicate, so neither Thomas nor Jennifer's mother ever learned the truth about her fate. They blamed each other for the disappearance and did not try to understand the situation to the end.
Patrick also knew nothing about what had happened. He simply sold the house and left, tired of endless problems with his brother. Thus, this tragedy remained completely hidden from all its participants, and only William, remaining the sole keeper of the terrible secret, lived his entire life with the heavy burden of his guilt. After William's confession, the town plunged into shock. No one could believe that a quiet and inconspicuous man had hidden such a cruel crime for so many years. The O'Connor family was completely destroyed by this news, and many relatives stopped communicating with each other forever, feeling guilt for not noticing that something was wrong. William was arrested and taken into custody, awaiting trial. His lawyers insisted on a psychiatric examination, claiming that he acted in a state of affect, not fully aware of his actions. But most of the town's residents did not want to believe this version. They demanded the harshest punishment, believing that justice should triumph in full measure despite the years that had passed. Soon, William O'Connor was found fully sane. The trial proceeded quickly, and the sentence was harsh. For many, this was a relief. The city could finally put a period to the case that had tormented every one of its residents for more than 20 years. The house on Chestnut Street remained abandoned and unwanted. Local residents avoided it, believing that the evil that had once settled there would never leave this place. Gradually, the building was falling apart, sinking into desolation and oblivion. But the main thing that all the town's residents now knew, truth sooner or later necessarily comes to light. Even the most terrible, even that which they try to hide behind the walls of an old basement, among rusty barrels and forgotten things.